Alright, another draft physics presentation. Yeah, I guess keep making them. Comments again. I'm in the habit, so I'll do it. I'm probably just wasting time. But, yeah, that's what the brain did. Sorry. So I made a response to Sir Isaac Newton, so I guess it's the cowboy, whatever, the fake account thing, steal identity thing, whatever. I couldn't find any response, so we'll delete that. So, oh, look at all this crap he typed. Well, we'll wait till he gets really stupid, and then we'll just say, I've read enough. Your problem, you just do not get mathematics. I get mathematics. I made my point. Mathematics doesn't explain the two-slit experiment. Mathematics doesn't explain what's happening in experiments. It just doesn't. Anything more complex than a circuit board, anything more complex than plugging that wire in and observing what happens, whatever. Mathematics is not necessarily about reality. Well, I'm doing this about reality. I don't really care about formulas that are incomplete enough that they can fit, but they're not really fitting, and that's really what you're defending. You're just defending some, well, we have a basic mathematical model. It's not complete. And it's vague, and it has some stuff in it that's wrong, but we don't know it's wrong yet, because we don't have enough resolution to see that it's wrong, that it's conceptually wrong. And that's what I would say your sine theta is. The reason why the math isn't very perfect is because you have it wrong. Alright, anyway. Alright, mathematics is not necessarily about reality. That part you seem to get, but you really lose the ball after that, whatever that. It's just useless rhetoric. You see, we start out with I don't know who this we is, with intuitive conceptions about space and quantity. We start out with these because we have had experiences in the real world. So I don't understand how my experiences are fundamentally different. I certainly have had experiences with the real world, and I understand that a lot of the real world is stuff I can't see, like radio waves and different things. And I have to make a educated guess about what those things really are. We start out with these because we've had experiences, and these experiences have left impressions about the abstract concepts. So again, you're saying they're abstract concepts. I'm saying they're physical concepts, really hard, physical, and they don't really have an abstraction. Their geometry isn't bent or crooked. It's straight, and the trick is to find the straight lines. But the thing is, space and quantity and number as native abstract concepts carry with them properties. Well, I'm all cool about identifying properties, and I think clearly physics has gone way beyond the evidence in establishing properties. It says a photon doesn't have a position. It's given it all kinds of properties I think have nothing to do with anything they can demonstrate with evidence. So that's where the argument is. For instance, the naive concept of space carries with it the property that there are 3 feet to a yard, regardless of whether you happen to be riding a steamboat or on the Thames, or whether you are in some far corner of the universe, light millennia away from the Earth. I'm going to argue that the distance between 2 points is always a consistent distance. This is where we disagree. You're saying that distance isn't consistent, that you can somehow change it by moving it or doing something. And my argument is, no, the 2 points are always the same. You can't contract or compress the space. You can't expand the space. The space is, the nothing is consistent. And you can't make it inconsistent. If 2 points are closer, it's because something moved them closer, a force. They can't move closer for no reason. For reasons that have nothing to do with a force impacting the things. The concept of number, well, again, the naive conception at least, carries with it concrete properties like 1 + 1 = 2. Yes, these are properties: oneness, two-ness, three-ness, four-ness. It's a ness. It's a thing something has. identifiable about it. It's a quality it has. One thing by itself has the quality of one thing by itself. Two things next to each other has the quality of two things next to each other. It's a quality something carries with it. But also more abstract properties like 1 plus any number is a number of any number plus 1 is greater than the number alone. So semantics, I guess. I'm not going to go for I'm not going to concede that there's any value in creating unreal numbers. So if you're just playing a number game with real numbers, I'm okay, but unreal numbers, forget it. It's just a trick. The formalizing step, which moves us from a naive impression to a formalization of mathematics, is to take these so-called properties, which make them axioms. Is to take these so-called properties and make them axioms. So again, yeah, I've sort of just made an axiom. I don't think unreal numbers are accurate descriptions of reality. They're just gimmicks to do something in a generalized sense that needs to be done in a more specific sense. So again, I would say your sine theta for the two-slit experiment is close to a reality, but it's wrong. Okay, it mimics in the sense it has some properties in common with what's really happening, but it's wrong. It's not what's really happening. All right. Now, the thing about axioms is that the objects to which they refer do not have concrete definitions. Well, the argument would be made is that you shouldn't make something an axiom until you're sure it's correct. So making axioms about the fact that space does something when it's incorrect is a huge mistake, in my opinion. So leaping to conclusions way ahead of the evidence, like the existence of dark matter or entanglement or all kinds of stuff, that little thin bit of evidence, big giant leap in conclusion, that's a mistake. So when you make things that are guesses and they're not very good guesses, in the sense you don't have a whole lot of evidence for the guess, and you make that an axiom, that's a critical error. They don't necessarily carry with them extensional definitions. Well, the point is the definition should be at least minimally complete. So I'm just saying, if you have a completely incomplete definition of function, like you say something like, we're going to axiomize photons, turn them into non-particles, say they're a wave packet in a hyperspace, those are a lot of axioms. All right, I think that's really dangerous physics. I think it's very immature physics, very undisciplined physics. We must rush to a conclusion kind of physics, rather than taking the time to say, well, before we make all of these extraordinary claims, maybe we ought to see if there's some ordinary explanations that create the effect. Oh, that's right, you have no idea what those terms mean. Well, one of the things you're going to have to get used to is that people who are serious about philosophy of science, again, I don't think there's any such thing as philosophy of science. I think philosophy is a science. Science is the first thing. Philosophy is a category of science. It's a category of deduction and figuring out the truth. And the subjects of philosophy are different than the subjects of material questions. Value questions are different than material questions. Like to use big words. So again, you're saying I have to play the game your way. I don't have to believe there's any such thing called the philosophy of science. I don't have to believe that your jargon is the special correct jargon. That's your declaration that you're playing the real game with your real words, and I'm arguing that no, you have the wrong game, you're playing the wrong game, and the right words are to recognize that, yes, philosophy is a category of science. Okay, it has the same rules. Facts are important, evidence is important before you draw conclusions. Same rules apply to philosophy as apply to deducing material functions. And if you want to have actual conversations with them, well, again, I want them to not be such cowards and be willing to defend the stuff they're preaching. You don't seem to want to be able to defend what you're preaching. You're defending a whole philosophy. I point out where it fails, and you don't provide any evidence countering the failure. You just insult me personally. So you're clearly demonstrating that you don't have a counter argument. I say the evidence is weak, you say absolutely nothing on the subject. I say you've jumped ahead of the evidence, you say nothing on the subject. You just keep declaring that you have the right conclusions. I point out that your evidence is incredibly weak, and you don't say anything rational to that question. You just claim, I'm right, I'm right, I'm right, I'm right. You must believe what I believe. I'm the Borg, you must believe. You must be assimilated. No, I don't have any obligation to be assimilated by a piece of shit Borg. I wouldn't kill you to learn what words mean. It wouldn't kill you to learn what words mean and to use them correctly. Well, again, I use a language that I feel is rich and deep enough to get the job done. So I think this is another faggoty little girly whine that I have to use your language, or I have to dress your way, or I have to do any of that shit. I think that's just complete nonsense. I know how to use words, and I know how to make myself understood, and you're just playing a game saying I don't understand. Yeah, no, that's just bullshit. You understand the sentence, you don't have enough evidence. You understand the analogy that you've jumped ahead of the cart. You understand that analogy. You put the cart ahead of the horses. You understand those analogies, so don't pretend you don't understand. You've jumped the evidence. You don't understand that? Anyway, as I was saying, the axioms of Euclid are as follows. So I don't really care about Euclid's axioms. You think that's relevant. Let's go back a few hundred years and decide what the truth is. I think it's fine to say there's a certain point in history. I would go more like the Einstein point, just where all the critical errors were made and all the biggest mistakes of jumping ahead of the evidence. It seems to me the past physicists were a lot more responsible in not claiming things they couldn't demonstrate with any evidence. And it seems the modern physics couldn't care less about having evidence. There is a straight line from any point to any point. Well, again, I think that can be defended as a truth. And you think there's bent lines and bent space and bent bullshit, and I'm saying you have way too little evidence to make that argument, in my opinion. I'm not persuaded, certainly. I don't see any persuasive evidence that anything does a curved line unless it's forced to do it by some force that moves it in a curve. That actually, even when you see a curved line, it's probably an least line, and it's not curved at all. I think the fundamental geometry, it can be demonstrated to be likely to be square geometry, that circles are not something nature makes. Circles are an illusion of perception. They're not an actual physical reality in nature. Nature doesn't make circles. Okay, any finite line segment may be extended without end continuously in a straight line. Any finite line segment may be extended without end. Well, it's a sort of an irrelevant axiom, isn't it? Does it really matter if the space has an end somewhere? I would certainly argue that it's conceivable, in my opinion, to believe that the universe might be a bubble, and that there might be a point in space where energy hits the bubble and bounces back in another form of energy, a more simple form. That's a feasible reality. But who knows? And again, how does it change physics any to play with infinity? Everything that's important that happens in physics that we're connected to, infinity is not relevant. For any point or for any distance, there is a circle centered at the point with radius that distance. For any point and for any distance, there is a circle centered at that point with a radius that distance. You can draw a circle on a radius, yes. Okay, so that's a long way of saying it's possible to tie a string to a pencil and put a thumbtack at one end of the string and then move the string in a circle. It's possible to do that, yes. All right angles are equal to one another. Another really uninteresting fact. I mean, so uninteresting. I don't know. Does he also say lines are also lines? That any line from point A to B is the same as any line from point A to B? I don't know. All dogs have fur or something? I don't know. The parallel postulate that if a straight line falling on two straight lines make an interior angle on the same side of the two right angles. Right, so intersecting lines create angles. Okay, that's simple enough. But who cares? Not really interesting. The elements also include the following 5 common notions. So this was where it's going to be a waste of time, I would think. I don't think elements were very well understood. Things that are equal to the same thing are also equal to one another. Well, whatever. I mean, duh. Shit. If equal are added to equal, then the whole are equal. The wholes are equal. Well, again, I don't. Obviously, you can add 1 to 2 or 2 to 1, and it's the same thing. Yes. Equals are subtracted from equals, then the remainder are equals. So yes, if you're minus 1 from 1, well, I don't know what that comes out to. But anyway, I mean, it's obviously 0, but I don't understand how 0 is equal to anything. But it doesn't matter. Things that coincide with one another are equal to one another. Again, you think these are important axioms or relevant axioms to the fundamental part of physics? Like physics needs to worry about this shit? Like this isn't already a foregone conclusion and totally undisputable and not in dispute in any of this? So why are we wasting time on this kindergarten crap that there's an A block and a B block and a C block? I mean, let's spell words, fuckhead. Alright, now from the modern perspective, I can't believe he typed all this crap. Maybe he cut and pasted it from somewhere. Now, from the modern perspective, these axioms are not exactly axioms. Yeah, they're simpletons. But more like intuitive descriptions. Well, I don't even think I think that's just a silly way to describe it as intuitive descriptions when you kind of know they're absolute fact. We invented the word angle to describe the very thing created when you cross two lines. So the words themselves are created by definitions of other words. So you can't avoid the factualness. Water is wet. The word wet was actually invented to describe what water is, so it can't really be in dispute. But for my purposes, we suffice to say they are axioms. Well, again, these are such irrelevant axioms, I just don't even know where you're going with this to waste my time with this bullshit. The thing about these axioms is that you could simply remove the words line, area, and we could even remove words like to, number, radius, and length. Well, I really don't think you're going to be able to remove them without me noticing. And replace them with more abstract terms. And those abstract terms will be obviously in dispute. So if you say when two pieces of space cross each other, they create an angle of counter space, then yes, that's going to be under dispute because that doesn't have any evidence supporting it. But for instance, instead of dealing with numbers, we could choose to deal with exclusively the sets. And again, so categories of numbers, groups of numbers, somehow it's going to be more illustrative than just dealing with the 1 + 1 = 2 math. I think that's enough math to use. Let's use the simple math first and don't use the complex stuff unless you have to. Which is sort of a term without definition. Fine. A mathematician would say that the word set in our context denotes a collection of objects. The point is that the words are arbitrary. Well, I don't consider words arbitrary. I certainly understand we have words in our vocabulary that are arbitrary, like love. I certainly wouldn't make a physics video about love. I certainly know there's words that have no value in a conversation, like the word random, for example, or spontaneous, that they're kind of broken words and that nobody should ever use them without contextually explaining that there is no such thing. Somewhere in their conversation they should make it clear that whenever I say random, I don't mean random. I just mean it looks random. It's complex enough that I can't see, okay, the bias, but the bias is there. Whatever words you use, the thing we are interested in are the relationships. Well, I've only said that 7 million times, that all formulas are in fact just a formalization of relationships. It's just making an explicit statement about something very specific and very dramatic and very solid about the fact that there's a relationship between two things. Alright, that makes words have, with that these words have with each other under some set of operators. Right, and the operators are pretty simple in most cases, is plus, minus, multiplication, division are the basic ones, and then there's more abstract ways to manipulate numbers. In the case of Euclid, his operators were addition, multiplication, and in more fundamental sense you could say that the construction of a line segment or the construction of a point or the construction of a circle given a line segment at a point were the fundamental operands. Again, I don't think the universe, I think the universe is full of geometry. The argument would be that Euclid had no idea how deep the geometry, how low it goes, and how complex it is in the insane amount of detail or redundancy, however you want to put it, the number of checkers that you can put on the board, and the fact that that means that these checkers can have insanely complex arrangements. And so it's fine if you want to say, yes, I believe the universe gets simpler as you go down, and the basic functions are just lines, and I would say the curved lines are illusions. So yes, I'm arguing it's all square geometry. You don't even need to do the circle geometry because that's a shortcut. It's not really the truth. The circle is in fact a bazillion or something. It has a bazillion little square edges on it. Okay. Fundamental operands of the geometry. When taken as a whole, these axioms together with these abstract operators produce an abstract structure. So again, you're saying it's abstract. I'm saying if you have it right, okay, if you have the right operators and the right operands, then you have a real model, not an abstract model. When Euclid took to proving facts about geometry, he still had a very definitive, extensional idea of mind in mind. I don't care. The line segment was to refer to the many instances of line segments that he had seen in the real world, like the height of a tree or the width of part of a road or something like this. Well, again, I don't see any productivity I don't see any real meaning in visualizing any deeper than you have to. So clearly I could break everything into a Planck constant width line, okay, but there's no point in visualizing that way, in my opinion. But fine, I don't understand. What's the point? Okay. But the point is that the formal system which resulted had a fundamental structure logically anterior to the extensional definitions associated with width. Structure. Logically anterior, so the structure is somehow separated from existential definitions associated with width. I don't agree with that, I don't think so, but that's as far as I'll say. I don't think so. Breadth or quantity. This structure is kept intact after we replace the words with formal placeholders like set or set of points. Again, that's just a generalization. So yes, I don't disagree that generalizations are appropriate. I'm just saying, exactly as I just stated, I don't think you need to understand something as each individual line has to be recognized. You just recognize that it's a quantity. And getting the quantity correct is important. So it's a 500 line width, and it's a a 500 line mass, and a 500, understanding that it's all quantity. And so that's sort of what I would like to call quantum mechanics should have been. Quantum mechanics should have been about understanding that there's quantities, and we can deal with these quantities as groups, and as we can call them something like a mass. And we can understand that the mass is made up of quantity. Of course, the question one must ask is how much, this just goes on and on, deep breath. Okay. Of course, the question one must ask is how much the result of geometry and formal structure of geometry refers to the real world. Okay. For instance, I really would hate the idea that this is just some crap cut and pasted off of something. So this is a little bit irritating. You're just going to post blog posts from people and I'm supposed to read them and answer them? I mean, I hate to pre-read all this stuff to see if it has something to do with something I'm arguing, but I don't really see where this has anything to do with my theory so far. Alright, how much results of geometry, the formal structure of geometry? Of course, the question one must ask is how much the results of geometry, the formal structure of geometry, refers to the real world. Well, exactly. So the question, I'm stating plainly that physics has missed a lot of these boats, where they have very circular geometry, when I think the geometry is very rigid and square. They have electrons spinning around circular solar system kind of idea, and I don't think it works that way. So there's lots of things I'm disputing about their model. I think their model is fundamentally moving the wrong way, and the interactions aren't being represented correctly. For instance, would proving the theorem about geometry prove something fundamental about the universe? I think clearly proving that the functions are square geometry rather than round geometry would be a huge change. The ancients never thought to ask such a question. Well, I give them credit for asking any questions at all, considering how shitty their lives were. For them, it was enough to say that since these axioms are obviously true, that thus self-proving, that any valid logical argument following from them must likewise be obviously true. But I'm just saying, obviously the following thing still has to be defended. There can be amounts of evidence. So clearly we can say that one axiom is established as a proof, the gun exists. Now, whether the gun was owned by O.J. Simpson or some other asshole is another open question. And we can have pieces of evidence that connect O.J. Simpson, one set of evidence, but it might be missing all these other sets of evidence, and there might be clearly evidence demonstrating, like more evidence demonstrating somebody else is the owner. Alright, let's see, where the hell did I leave off? That any valid logical argument following from it must likewise be obviously true. The problem with this approach is borne out in the failed attempts to axiomize Newton's calculus. I guess it depends on whether you're going to recognize that Newton's calculus is incomplete. So the argument isn't that Newton's calculus is fundamentally flawed in the sense that it has wrong elements in it. It's just that it doesn't have enough elements in it. Although it was relatively easy and straightforward, seemingly, to settle upon a simple set of axioms. Well, I don't think Einstein's axioms of bent space improve Newton at all. I don't think the idea of putting time into a gravity well, creating space-time, improved Newton at all. I think those are fundamentally wrong and have nothing to do with improving anything. The fact that Einstein's math included the speed of light, which Newton was missing, was important. And the fact that Einstein essentially did what I've been talking about, which is he separated M1 and M2 and recognized that the two forces are not combining to create a force. They are in fact separate forces and should be understood as separate forces. Although it was relatively easy and straightforward, seemingly to settle upon a simple set of axioms from which Euclidean geometry would be derived. The exact opposite occurred with Newton's calculus. Well, again, the calculus part is always going to be difficult because it's a generalization. You can't do the math in the Planck manner. You can't reanalyze a system every Planck constant of a millisecond. So you have to generalize. And those generalizations, those averagings, are not necessarily the explicit truth, and that's the danger. So when you start to get more and more resolution, you need more decimal places in your answer, then all of a sudden you're going to see the Elysing, and the circle is no longer a circle. So I don't even understand the relevance of this. Again, I'm not defending Newton's calculus, although I will defend it if you're going to fucking insult it. But it in no way has anything to do with my theory. So I don't know what you're talking about. Everything in Newton's calculus, I agree, exists. M1 exists, M2 exists, and the inverse square law exists. And those are the important ones. The other constants are just a matter of creating relatives to volumes, of force. They're not necessary to the equation. You see, there are loads of contradictions which arose when one considered infinitesimal line segments. And exactly that's my point, that we're not understanding the grain of the universe. It's sand, and we're talking about things the size of a baseball. So we can't see the sand. We don't see that the edge of the baseball has got a bunch of sand on it. But that is the truth. Anyway, so after a few centuries, there was a radical paradigm shift in how axioms are viewed. In the future, like I said, I'm not going to really read a comment unless you somehow point out how it's relevant to my physics, because this is not relevant to anything I'm arguing. It was no longer the case that axioms could be taken as self-evident. In fact, the best that could be hoped for was that the system of axioms for calculus was that they were consistent. So again, I just argue that calculus is never going to be perfect, and the generalizations are satisfactory. So I'm saying pi is a satisfactory statement to make, that there is such a thing, although it is incorrect in the sense that it's not a real number. So, but who cares, because for 99.999 cases it's going to work just fine, but it's not a real number. That there were no formal mathematical statements which contradicted each other. Anyway, for instance, if you're working in a logical framework and that logical framework contains in it some logical contradiction, so again you're saying there's something in contradiction in Newton's calculus, and I think that's just bullshit. There's just elements missing. Then all the segments within the framework become meaningless. For instance, if the statement is it is raining and then it is not raining are both true, well, again, I'm not even going to, this is just word games, then you can derive any result one wishes. So anyway, who would have axioms of two contradicting things? And so again, you're saying Newton created contradictions. I don't think you can validate or defend that argument. So what's the point of this mush? For instance, another stupid for instance, no doubt. Since it's not raining, it is true the following, that it is raining is false. But when we have that it is raining, well, the problem is that we don't have a precise enough definition of the word raining, because we're saying fog is rain, or is fog not rain? And that's where the real problem is here. The problems aren't in arranging logic. The problem are our understanding that our obligation is to connect dots. The problem is people are creating imaginary dots. Alright, implies pigs fly is true tautologically. By the way, please look up the definition. Oh, fuck it. Yeah, that's right. I'm not going to do that. What's the point? But then since it's raining, it's also true. I'm just saying you want to use these words that you think there's value in a word called tautology. And I don't see any value in it at all. It's just a bullshit word for definitions. I'm just saying, obviously we can define what things are. Things have shapes. We have created words to describe things like black and white. We have descriptive words, and that's all we have to do is use them to define something. Why do I need a word like tautology? What purpose does it have? I see no purpose in it. It's a silly redundancy. Of course I'm talking about real things. I'm not talking about fantasy things. There's cause and effect universe. That's my premise. That's one of my axioms. It's all cause and effect. So I don't need the word tautology to restate the obvious, that everything has to be connected to something else for some reason. I don't say anything because it's not connected to the other things I said. They'll follow an order, a sequence, a logical sequence. It follows that pigs actually do fly in that framework, and of course you can replace pigs fly with pigs do not fly, or I don't know what this is. So. But that means that there's no actual content in this logical framework. Again, this is just such mush. We might as well replace any statement in the framework with some I guess it was descript symbol. Nondescript, yeah. And the framework has the exact same logical structure. So the logical framework is meaningless. You derisively mock. Finally, we get to something about me. You derisively mock logicians. I mock the word logician, by the way. When they play word games like this sentence is false. Yes, I mock this entire rubbish. This has absolutely nothing to do with whether or not I'm saying something that's actually defendable logically. Do I have evidence for what I'm saying? Does it fit the pattern? Is it when you say something like push is a simpler force than pull? Is that a true statement or an untrue statement? That's all I wish you to measure. Can you make an argument that somehow a pull is simpler than a push? But you're forgetting that these logical paradoxes were discovered at a point in history. So he thinks there's a logical paradox somewhere. I don't see any of these paradoxes. Things are either black and white and heavy and light, and there's up and there's down. I mean, there's just no point for me to have this argument that there's any true paradoxes in the real universe. You believe there are, I don't believe there are. If you're creating a paradox in what you're saying, or you're arguing in defense of a theory that has paradoxes, then you're failing. You're not winning. You've unsuccessfully gotten to the truth. Logical paradoxes were discovered at the point in history when mathematicians and physicists, again, to consider mathematicians physicists, I think, is a mistake, but whatever. We're seeking to find some foundation in which to ground their theoretical results. Well, that's a key point in here, is this recognition of when something's theoretical and when something's worth axiomizing. And I'm saying that your physics doesn't seem to be able to rationally understand those concepts. You see, they were like you, and they were stuck in the ancient way of thinking. So again, I don't understand how any of this is at all relevant. This silly abstract reasoning that because somebody else was wrong in history, I'm wrong. I mean, I really have no obligation to fit my logic into some kind of weird stream you want it to be put in. I make simple accusations. I make simple statements. Electrons and protons are the magnetic monopoles. I've given the reasons why I believe that. You should be giving me counter reasons why it can't be true. You're not doing that. You're playing some kind of insanely long word game. They still thought, like Euclid, that you could find self-proving axioms. I've never talked about self-proving axioms. I've never argued that there's such a thing as a self-proving axiom. I'm arguing that in certain cases the proof is absolute, like when you say water is wet, because the very fact that the word wet exists to describe what water is. The word pain describes a real thing that actually we experience and we have, and the word arises out of its existence. The word wouldn't exist if the thing didn't exist. We don't have to draw lines like in grammar school between words that are connected, because the connection between the words was established by the creation of the word. And you could base a physical theory on those. So again, I'm arguing for solid axioms. The foundation of my theory is that most of the things I say are true because of evidence. Now, the things I'm arguing against, many of the issues about whether whether time is a dimension or not, the evidence isn't going to be hard evidence for either side, and so it's going to be an argument about a bigger context where I'm going to try to explain that the universe isn't a fractal and the universe isn't this and it isn't that, and that's why time can't really be a physical dimension like up, down, left, right, or forward and back. Okay. I forgot where I was. They still thought, like Euclid, could find self-proving axioms, and you could base a physical theory on those. So again, I deny that I have done any of this self-proving axiom bullshit. I think that's just nonsense. Rather than go out into the world and take measurements and base their theories on that. So again, you're claiming that I don't have respect for evidence, which is a lie, a disgusting lie. I've performed experiments on my fucking porch to demonstrate certain things as truths. I have a great deal of respect for experiments. I don't have much respect for the people who interpret experiments with bizarre notions that I've measured a photon, I captured it 15 yards away, and it was exactly the same photon. I think those bold claims should be greeted with a tremendous amount of skepticism. So there is a big collough over whether Archimedes, sorry, my vision is a bit blurry, could be grounded arithmetic. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, I should have figured that out. Could be grounded in a self-consistent set of axioms. Obviously, I think the fundamental arithmetic can be. The pi part of arithmetic, the more abstract elements of arithmetic, cannot be understood as having value in certain circumstances but being very dangerous in other circumstances. But clearly 1 plus 1 equals 2 is, in a sense, a self-proving axiom because we gave the number 1 to something that was 1, and we gave the label 2 to something that was 2. So it's a proof. It's already been proven by the creation of the label. Alright, Gödel proved, well this isn't going to be a great statement because I don't think he proved shit, that it was impossible for any such set of axioms to prove themselves. So again, I just think that's insanely stupid. I mean, I think it's reasonable to say you can't ever absolutely prove something beyond the first definition. So the first definition, water is wet. That one's solid. Everything on top of that is going to be an association by similarity. And those similarities are never identical similarities. Like there's nothing identical to water. So every time I say something else is wet, I'm slightly altering the definition of wet. And that's, the more you alter the definition, the further you get away, then you end up with these complex questions of whether or not fog is wet. Alright, anyway. And this pipe dream was abandoned. Well, whatever. I don't know how you're connecting this to my overt statements about absolute physical properties that exist in the universe. Whether photons, whether Heisenberg is true or false. These are the questions. You're saying that somehow I'm wrong because somehow I violated Gödel by disagreeing with you. I mean, you don't see how this is a fucktardedly insane argument? I mean, completely fucktardedly insane in the sense, couldn't I just turn it around and point the finger at you and say you're the one violating vocabulary by saying you know something's a wave? But along the way it was discovered that one did not need to accept Euclid's fifth axiom. Again, I don't have to accept any of them because I think they're all just so simple that it's too stupid to argue. It was independent of other axioms, so there exist different geometries where parallel lines do intersect at points. So again, I don't accept that as all. That's just absolute nonsense. Parallel lines, if they're parallel lines, never intersect. You're bending space again. You're playing a game again, saying that you have some component you're going to throw into the game to bend things. I'm saying there is no bending. So if you can't defend the bending, then what's the point of us having this conversation? You're saying that I'm not allowed to say the universe doesn't permit you to change the environment. The universe is the universe. It's a consistent universe. You're saying, no, it isn't. I have some evidence that in some place the parallel lines collide. I think that's just absolute nonsense. Just see, Euclid's fifth axiom, do intersect at points, whether you like it or not. Again, I don't have any reason to even wonder whether I like it or not. I think it's a preposterous assertion by you that you've ever demonstrated any such thing existing. There is no demonstration. Experimentation has demonstrated that the actual universe does not really obey this fifth postulate. You say, I say you're bullshit. Fuck you. You're an idiot. Believe what you want, religious person, because your evidence doesn't exist. Your God doesn't exist. Your bent line doesn't exist. Your proof doesn't exist. It's all just you say so. Nothing else. And that's why we refer to space as bent. So again, a bold claim based on no evidence. I want to argue the evidence. Where's your fucking evidence? You don't have fucking evidence. But it doesn't matter what word you use. It does matter. So again, it's pretty silly to say it doesn't matter. You're saying there's some mechanism changing the distance between points that doesn't have to do with energy pushing things together. I'm saying that doesn't happen in the universe. There's no evidence that happens in the universe, that any fake energy. Their energy always has to be in a form, like a photon, like a piece of radiation, like something. It has to be something that moves the two things together. The nothing never moves two things together. It's just a silly notion in your silly head. And you have absolutely no evidence to defend you asserting it as a truth that I must believe. You have no right to do that. No ground to stand on to defend that behavior. You have no right to even pollute a poor kid's brain with some silly notion that you have any evidence for it. You should be honest and admit you have almost nothing to stand on to preach this idiotic theory. But it doesn't matter what word you use. The point is that the structure of the universe is such that any formal system which is sufficient to encompass the experimental properties, the extensional properties of these experiments must include non-Euclidean notions of distance and time. And you're saying it must. Now, I don't know how to argue this any clearer. I say you have absolutely no evidence to defend this statement. None. But bizarre extrapolations where you take a grain of truth. There's a relationship between velocity and a change in radioactive decay. Well, how does that prove anything? What else do you have? Photons are bent by gravity. And I'd argue that every one of the experiments where you have any indication of that might be true are ones where I could argue that it was scatter that caused the experimental results. You have no clean evidence of this being a truth. No clean evidence whatsoever that a photon's ever been bent by gravity. No evidence that a force is bent by a force. These are just assertions you're making. No evidence of anything being bent. And I can make a clear argument that the Earth isn't bending around the Sun. That is in fact two forces being constantly combined, and the Earth in its material form, the actual atoms inside of the Earth, are jiggling up and down the whole trip. They're aleasing around the orbit. They're not smoothly going around. They're going down and they're going up, and they're going down and they're going up, constantly. Anyway, and these experiments must include non-Euclidean notions of distance and time. So I just, whatever. Just bold assertion on incredibly weak evidence. You can't wrap your head around this because you lack curiosity. An amazing statement coming from the Borg. You're sitting here with this incredible lack of evidence, claiming you closed the book. Your mind is the closed mind, asshole. My mind was the open mind. My mind was the one that said, this all sounds like a bunch of religious woo. Photons don't know where they are. Photons split in two. New universes are created every time a fart goes out of my ass. I mean, it just sounds like complete nonsense. I was the one curious, and I said, there's got to be a better answer, and I found it. Yeah, so your theory is wrong. Okay, well, you haven't proven it with evidence at all, and this mush of an argument, because somebody was wrong once, you're wrong, is mush. Anyway, it simply doesn't simply doesn't describe the universe we live in. Well, of course it does. You haven't shown me one evidence, one experiment that I can't explain. None. I mean, unless you're going to show me an experiment, I'm going to have to spend 6 months studying to point out the flaw in it. And as I've pointed out already, with a little bit of study of the interferometer, I've pointed out lots of irregularities in what you assume and what you propagandize to be the function of this device. And you apparently were so uncurious about how it works that you never examined the facts, never examined what a beam splitter was, you never examined how you can create patterns with dirt on glass. You never examined any of this stuff. You just propagandized your dogma. You're just a dogmatic troll. Oh yeah, so your theory is wrong. It simply doesn't describe the universe we live in. And in fact, that you don't want Euclidean geometry to be true. I don't care about Euclidean geometry. I just don't care about these titles you want to put on things. I believe in geometry. I believe there are squares and there are right angles. There's all kinds of things that are real. And there are real things in the real universe. The physical universe has straight lines in it, and they have straight lines at angles in 3 dimensions. There's 3 dimensions, and there's lines in those 3 dimensions. That's the most basic fact, the most basic axiom that I think is rigidly true. And none of them are curved by themselves or by bending space. Alright, to be true is just bias. So, you say so. I've defended why I have this different belief than yours, because I've listened to your conclusions based on your premises. Your conclusions are factually insane. I mean, I react to them by saying, that's crazy talk, UFO, loopy, doopy, nutty shit. That's a 3-bear conclusion. And then I looked at your evidence from which you drew the conclusion. I see it's full of holes, it's weak as fuck. You've jumped way ahead of what the evidence defends. So on both grounds, you're wrong as fuck, in my opinion, calling yourself scientists, because you're just religious kooks preaching a dogma. Your facts are just as bad as the religious kooks' facts, and your conclusions are just as useless as any kind of fucking reality. I mean, the stupid religious kooks can't even invent a rational heaven. The Muslims think you're allowed to rape 60 virgins, and the Christian kooks don't even give you anything to have sex with. And you're saying it's heaven. You're kind of fucking retarded. Alright, it is the same bias that the people of Euclid's time had about self-proving axioms. So again, he's claiming I'm relying on a self-proving axiom, which I think is totally indefensible. I don't think my axioms are any less solid than the ones you're pretending to claim are axioms. So I think that's just the biggest pile of horseshit. You're such a dishonest, creepy piece of crap to sit there and imply that somehow you're on the right side of being a valuer of hard evidence when you clearly don't value it. You think there are some statements about the world which are absolutely true, obviously true, but you are forgetting that the only reason you think they are true is because you made observations, that you created a model in your head about the properties of the universe. I believe they're true because they fit evidence, so I keep citing the evidence. Okay, why Maxwell's equations are fundamentally, in a general sense, correct is because they fit the observed results. And I'm also pointing out a model that fits those results, that doesn't use something called a virtual something as the force carrier. It uses a real something something. So again, just keep playing a game. My model obviously explains why magnets can create this incredible pressure that moves them together and moves them apart. I'm explaining the phenomenon consistent with the evidence. So again, just a lie to say somehow I'm just making a model in my head and I'm only pretending it works because I have talking bears or I have some magical function. The functions clearly aren't magical. They're very rudimentarily and very crude in their function. Very few properties. Properties of the universe. Then the truth is that your model is probably wrong, not completely wrong, whatever that means. Clearly I have no lack of confidence in that my model is correct because it's so simple and it fits everything really well, spectacularly well. In the case of magnetism, it's a spectacularly great fit. I mean, even if that flat earth model is entirely sufficient for an, I don't know, architect, because the curvature is negligible at some small scale, the round earth model only becomes clearly superior when one wants to navigate the oceans or do something on a large scale. Well, I don't see how the flat earth model changes navigating the oceans as long as you think they're forever. But anyway, clearly, again, just keep talking like you're somehow on the side of logic when you're the one on the side of made-up assumptions, dark matter, just complete voodoo, complete invisible man, God of the gap, and solutions to problems that have no logical foundation, in the sense when you trace the reason for the belief, there is no evidence. You're the one with the huge bias. My physics is perfectly sufficient for the vast majority of things humans do. I don't know, whatever. This doesn't have anything to do with what humans do. It has to do with whether or not it's an honest representation of where the evidence points, where the facts point. You say it's a completely honest representation, it's completely consistent where the evidence points. I'm saying the evidence clearly doesn't point to these two contradicting descriptions of force. The quantum mechanical model of force and the bent space model of force are completely incompatible, and they will in the end destroy both, as they should. But it fails when objects are moving very fast relative to one another, and you don't have any experience with that either. So you have absolutely no experience with things moving very fast relative to each other. You're just making up what happens in those scenarios. And again, why should they even argue your mystical theories about what happens at the speed of light? Because they're just mystical theories. That's why mathematical models with predictive capacity. So again, more predictions. I'm pointing out how your predictions aren't correct. Einstein predicted that photons are moved by gravity. His prediction is not correct. You don't have any evidence for it. You just believe it. Okay? So again, you're just stating that you have all these correct predictions. I'm saying you've never predicted a motherfucking thing. All you've done is describe things that we know are in the world, and you've made an excuse for them. And that's all Einstein was doing. Again, the Time Machine novel was written long before Einstein started bending time. People had speculated about what would happen if you accelerated past the future. They speculated about these kind of things. So again, to sit there and say that somehow Einstein predicted something, when no, all he's doing is trying to incorporate something. All you're doing is describing what you're seeing, and you're describing it in a phantasmagorical, fun way rather than in a serious way. Productive capacity are superior to models which don't do that. So again, this productive capacity, all that crap is just a bunch of horseshit. I've been in a shop that invents things. I've seen how invention happens, and inventions don't really happen with mathematics. The idea to try something usually doesn't have anything to do with a mathematical formula. The mathematics has to be applied once you try to force it to work. But the idea of mixing two things together, the math isn't necessary. And if you don't like it, go to a different universe. So again, you know, obviously your mind is totally closed. You're a retard. Fuck you. Blah blah blah. Case motherfucker closed. So he thinks with this argument he has demonstrated that your evidence is not weak. Okay, this is a proof that their evidence isn't weak. They have hard evidence of Heisenberg. They have hard evidence that photons are not a particle. They have hard evidence that photons are bent by gravity. They have hard evidence that time is a dimension warped by the gravitational curvature. It's just amazing that you think you've accomplished your task and been a responsible scientist by puking this crap as an argument. I'll give you credit for being one hell of a typer, but that's it. But fuck you in general. Okay. Quantum fuck you. Another great name. Thanks. Let's see what this is. It's a Twitter. Oh, look at that. It's a little picture. Isn't that cute? Why don't you make it spin around? It'd be so much more interesting. Ugh, idiots. Waste my time. Waste my time. Oh, here he is again. Alright, if you want to increase your odds of being taken seriously, again, I really don't care. I've made arguments. You can either make counter-arguments or you can't. I'm calling you out as being cowards, okay? I think your physicists are cowards. You can't make a rational argument. You're afraid of the goddamn interaction. You're afraid. They're afraid they're going to look stupid, and it's that simple. They're fucking cowards. Alright, they're sitting on fake, phony pedestals thinking they're all pompous, smart fuckers, and they'll never take on the challenge. They'll only be interviewed by people who are friendly. They're never going to be interrogated on their physics because they will look like fucking fools. So I'm calling you out. I've called them out with real cash prizes, and they still won't show up because they're fucking cowards. Seriously, by somebody in the physics community. Like I said, I'm really not interested in their applause or any other statement. I'm interested in their arguments, and you don't have any. Clearly, I just spent fucking half my life reading a big pile of drivel that proved nothing, demonstrated no evidence of anything provided whatsoever, but a statement saying, we're right and you're wrong. And that's it. That's your evidence. You don't see how putrid that is? You don't see how puke-worthy that is as evidence? Nobody's that blind. Maybe you should do everything in your power to avoid looking like a raving lunatic. Again, I just couldn't care less, with a stupid haircut. So again, Einstein's hair was a mess. Einstein actually smelled. He wet his pants. Lots of stories about that. You don't understand that history, idiot? Man, you're really stupid then. Have you ever bothered trying to put together a work that is at least attempts to emulate Newton's principles in its logical flow, precision, elegance, and extraordinary power? So again, you say it had all of those things. That's your opinion. Fine. Again, his argument was really simple, in the sense he was just describing the inverse square law. This theory is a bit more complicated than Newton's theory. This is called the unification theory, shithead. Anyway, no, instead all you got is a slapshod pile of shit. And then that's just your opinion, okay? You still haven't dealt with a single one of my arguments. So you're saying it's a pile of shit to discover that a single piece of glass bends light perfectly, 50-50. And that the only reason why they're using more complex pieces of glass to bend it is because they're putting diffraction gradient in between the layers of glass, and therefore they're diffracting the light and creating two different light beams. Not two light beams that are identical, but two light beams that aren't identical. In my opinion, that's a proven fact now. And where have any of you dealt with that proven fact? Where have you? Where have you responded to that proven fact? So that's one of the pieces of my shit. So one of the pieces of my shit is that proven fact. Where have you demonstrated an answer to it? One of the statements of my pile of shit is that your two-slit experiment in photons doesn't create the proper gradation pattern. Where's your proof that it does? Where's your evidence that it does? Do you have evidence that it does? I mean, real hard evidence, an image, an experiment? You have experimental evidence that it does create the right pattern? Show it to me. So you're the ones with shit. You have nothing. You provide nothing. You just keep claiming you're right and I'm wrong and I don't have the proper hairdo. And you're attempting to say you're a credible arguer. You're making the credible argument. When I would say to the court of any intelligence, if there's UFOs out there, you may pull my guts out and eat them if you think this idiot has the better argument. Would you be willing to say the same thing? Are you willing to be gutted like a fish based on this stupid argument? I mean, I wish I could really impose these challenges on people, because you deserve it. You really do. You're so obnoxiously arrogant, and your arguments are so fucking idiotic. Okay, a couple of armchair style. Again, who cares? There's no arms on my chair, by the way. I mean, it couldn't be more irrelevant. Would you care whether Einstein's chair had arms on it if you could actually see a video where Einstein was talking physics? Wouldn't it be really nice to hear and really interesting regardless of what Einstein was sitting in? So again, you're saying I should care about what kind of chair a physicist is sitting in. That's somehow important. Explaining your theory no better than an 8th grade science project. So again, but you don't have any answers. Your answers are less than an 8th grader. You're just throwing poo, shithead. You can't do any better than throwing poo. Monkeys do that. You're not making a counter argument or providing counter evidence. You're just talking shit. Bold shit for which you put up nothing. You're such a lame, weaselly cunt. Alright. Alright. Bits, I mean, I don't know if there's any point in reading any further than this. Bits of much needed clarification littered throughout hundreds of other videos no one will realistically watch. Again, you say no one's watching them, but people are watching them, retard. But what you're not doing is providing counter arguments to any of them. A hideous and disorganized website. And hideous, why? Because it has text written on it with images explaining the text. So it's hideous because it has text on it that you can read and images related to the text. And that's the definition of hideous. Fuck you again. What you need to do, what? Put a big ad up first? Like most of the physics sites on the web now, where you can't even read the article because the pop-up ad pops up. I should have some more pop-ups. I have none, by the way, but I mean I should add some pop-up ads to make it more fun, and some other ads, image ads, because that makes it more fun. Amazing. I'm not saying great physics can't come from anywhere. Well, you seem to be pretty clearly saying that somehow it's important if the website is pretty, and it's really not important whether the fucking text is legible and the images are related to the text. I mean, as I pointed out the other day, a whole article on doing Eddington's experiment, and not one single shred of evidence included. Not one shred. Einstein came from a patent office. Well, again, who cares? This whole endeavor of yours is clearly nothing more than a masturbatory fetish to bolster your fragile ego. I don't need this channel at all. I have a much bigger channel I can make more videos on, and if I had them monetized I'd make more money and all that kind of stuff. So this has absolutely nothing, in my opinion, to do with my ego. It has to do with the fact that exactly how this whole thing started is documented and plainly visible by anyone who cared to cite the truth. So the truth is in the videos themselves, the responses to the idiots, and clearly the whole point of me doing this was because I argued the two-slit experiments were ludicrously silly, insanely silly, and no adult should have fallen for it. It was so silly. And I said plainly, I'm going to go find the right answer, and I found it. Okay, you haven't enough subterfuge to beguile an idiot following while showing absolutely no respect for the time of your superiors. Amazing. But regardless, so my superiors, if they're wrong, like Professor Lewin doing the radar experiment where they put the sound signal on top of the radar and pretend they've proven interference when they have done no such thing, nobody should point out that that experiment might be fundamentally flawed. That's wrong. Okay? And when you point out how it could be fundamentally flawed and you say to people, prove that that's not true. Show me the evidence that it isn't true, that this is probably what's going on. And they show no evidence whatsoever. It's no wonder you spend so much time picking apart such insipid comments like yours that are obviously designed to troll you 9 out of 10 times. Well, regardless of what they're designed for, I'm giving you people the benefit of the doubt. So I'm being the fair cop here. I'm giving you a chance to demonstrate your intelligence. And every time I give you an opportunity to demonstrate your intelligence, what do? You spit up and fart. Yeah. Sorry, you're the loser. Alright, so I will read these other comments and then move on. I don't know if I'll bother with Superior Mind's going to be on my side here. There are some people who take it seriously because they understand it. Alright, well, that's good enough. So let's go to this idiot. Interferometer fails. Another fake account. I actually agree that OP's post isn't really good. It has the wrong implications, and appearances matter on these topics, although it is practically sound. I don't even know what that means. There is some people, okay, so he's quoting Superior Mind, I guess. There are some people who would take it seriously because they understand it and are interested in the truth. It was already shown that the double slit experiment can have one of its openings covered from a comparatively far distance, and the single slit pattern would be recovered. Where was it proven? So again, these are amazing statements. He says that somewhere he has proof of that, and there's no such proof. Where's your proof? Are you talking about the thing you did with paper or something? You're calling that proof? There was some real good visual evidence of a proof that you hold the paper here, and you have your two-slit experiment here, and somehow because the paper is here, it turns into the single-slit experiment? There's no chance of that being true because this new edge is going to create another pattern. And it's going to end up superimposed on the other pattern. So all you can do is blur the first pattern by imposing a second pattern. Because this edge is going to create a pattern, retard. Amazing. But anyway, there's no proof here. This is just this argument that you have provided a proof is just so insipid. So post the link again to your proof. Let's go analyze your fucking proof and let's see if it has any integrity at all. You keep claiming you have demonstrated something and you demonstrate nothing. You know, you ignored this. I know you saw Inmendum fail to address it. Again, where is this? Where do you have evidence? Fail to address what? Something I couldn't see? Yeah, I failed to address the non-obvious evidence. Why do you do this? Why do you imply you care about the truth and then ignore the counter-argument? So he says there's some counter-argument somewhere. So somewhere he's proven that the two-slit experiment in photons, or the single-slit for that matter, creates the proper wave balance, the intensity balance. Somewhere he's proven that single pieces of glass do not make superior beam splitters. Where have you done that? Somewhere he's proven that when radio waves are superimposed, that somehow the receiver can still receive two superimposed radio stations. The two radio stations can bleed over each other out of phase, and that you'll still be able to hear the two stations. If you think there are ways to salvage the theory, okay, but you don't even acknowledge the flaws. And again, what flaws? I'm asking for the flaws to be posted. Where have you posted evidence of a flaw? Please post your evidence of the flaw. I'm the one who's pointed out the flaw in your evidence. Where have you countered my argument about the flaws in your evidence? Somebody just posted me this proof of the Eddington experiment being successfully accomplished. Yet I go to the page and there's absolutely no evidence, okay, that any such thing has been accomplished. No evidence to peruse, no evidence to analyze, just a grandiose statement that everything went great and I proved it. And that's what you call evidence. I call that nothing. I call that propaganda. And most likely rely on DraftScience on giving replies that may or may not address the point. Well, the point is that I am attempting to address your points. I'm pleading with you to provide something called real evidence, a quality piece of evidence somewhere, and you don't do it. Look, if you want comprehensible concepts of underlying mechanism, that's fine. I don't disagree. If you want comprehensible concept or underlying mechanism, that's fine. I don't disagree. I don't know what that even means, but clearly that's Superior Minds just validating the point that he understands what I'm saying as I understand it. It makes perfectly good sense, this mechanical model. And he doesn't see any need to believe in fantasy things anymore because they're completely unnecessary. The problem is that he lies. So again, an accusation that isn't based on anything. So yes, you're being blocked. The problem is that he lies about his knowledge and he doesn't even admit it. So again, where have I ever lied about any of this crap? It's an insanely irrational statement. Where have I lied about an education I got or something I did? Where? It's just such a lie to lie about people like this. It's just disgusting that you think you have a right to say I have lied about anything on these videos. It's an outrageous statement. You fucking piece of shit liar. Okay, with very few exceptions, that maybe some things presented he didn't understand. So again, I'm not going to argue that I was obligated to call every time I misunderstood something me lying. I didn't know that a misunderstanding was the same as lying. So if that's your definition, you're retarded. If he did that, people would try to adjust what they are trying to say. I don't need to adjust what I have adjusted what I've been saying. That's why I've changed things from ton to bit. It's because I'm trying to adjust it to some language that you can better understand. Just for the most recent examples is good. He kept saying over and over again authoritatively that the Hubble telescope should be pointed right next to the sun, and I still assert that it can be. I mean, the fact that they say, well, look, it's kind of dangerous and our paint might wrinkle and it's possible that the temperature might do something, and you're saying that NASA can't figure out how to prevent that from happening. And I gave you a simple example of how they could prevent all of that from happening by just lifting the door. Leaving the door up, okay, having the sun on the side of this door, and there's no real possibility that a single ray of the sunlight could possibly get into the telescope. Now, what's your counter argument? See, my obligation is to explain why their 50-degree thing is because they're pretending there's no way to prevent light from getting into the telescope, you know, at an angle. And my argument is yes, there's lots of ways to prevent that, and the simplest one is to have the door on that side, and you've prevented it. So what's your counter argument to that fact? That you can change that degree from 50 degrees to 4 degrees by simply opening the door. What's your counter argument? Oh, that's right, you don't have one. All right, authoritatively, the Hubble telescope should be pointed right next to the sun. Apparently, though, the situation is much more complicated. You say it's very complicated. I'm saying it's not really complicated. Yes, there are concerns. You have to be careful, blah, blah, blah. But this is far from unsurmountable complications. No, they're very surmountable. Because it wasn't designed for those types of missions. And again, NASA is famous for converting missions. Okay? They even had to do it with the Hubble telescope. The mirror was wrong when they originally went up, and they compensated for the errors in the mirror. They're famous for overcoming flaws and problems. I pointed that out in the last video, that they rescued the Apollo 13 guys in a rather incredible way through innovation and troubleshooting. And they're sort of famous for it. And the fact that you're saying they're crippled here, they can't do anything, they can't use all their knowledge to figure out how to open the door. There can be heat issues, and it was meant for extremely faint light. Well, again, the amount of light is clear in the fact that we know how much light there isn't if there's no atmosphere scattering it. So we know it's very little light getting in, and the very point is we want to be able to resolve very dim stars. So the very point would be to get very little light in the telescope. And clearly the earthbound telescopes could do it. If I removed the atmosphere, they would have no problem. So you're insisting that this telescope is fundamentally different than the earthbound telescopes, and I'm going to argue it's not fundamentally different, and these arguments are just pretty much bullshit. And then I gave you the counter argument that even if I concede your point that the Hubble telescope is a piece of shit and can't be modified to do anything interesting, there's a ton of other telescopes in space, and one of them should be able to accomplish the task. Another example, he says, Mercury's precession is due to the wobbling of the sun. Well, it's not really wobbling, it's precessing just like Mercury is. Some of the arc seconds are due to the wobbling, but that does not account for the 43 arc seconds. You say it doesn't. So what's your evidence that it doesn't? From what I've seen is that the one half of the problem with Newton's math is fixed by the speed of light, and the other half of the problem is fixed by recognizing that the mass of the sun is in motion. His statement that GR used the wobbling to solve the mystery is false. Well, okay, so you're making a claim. Let's see if you have any evidence. GR calculations given the 43 seconds of Mercury are done assuming the sun is stationary. Well, obviously that would be a huge mistake. The point is GR is that it modifies the inverse square law. if you're modifying the inverse square law, isn't that the same thing as moving the center of mass? The modification to the inverse square law is the movement of the center of the mass. It's not changing the effect at a distance, it's changing the effect at the source. Alright, so at least he has a paper on it. I don't know if I'm going to bother reading this, because this is such a specific and narrow point. But again, you're entitled to disagree if you wish on the subject. I'm still going to assert, okay, that I have read plenty of articles by professional mathematicians who have made the assertion that there's no bent anything in Einstein's math, that it is simply accounting for the fact that the motion of the sun is what Newton wasn't accounting for. So, I mean, obviously I don't do this math. I'm not a mathematician. So, I've seen the analysis by people who are mathematicians, and I find their arguments persuasive. Maybe there's an argument here, there is some text, and I'll read it, but I'm just saying I'm not convinced that there's anything in Einstein's math that proves the existence of something called bent space-time. Alright, but he kept saying over and over that GR is all about the inverse square law. Nowhere did I say that. I said it's about the speed of light and the movement of the sun's center of mass. And I even was clear to say that the mass moves, not the sun, the mass. Okay, the density moves. What do you make of this? The fact that he says things without really knowing if something is true or not, and doesn't concern you at all, really? So again, he's saying he has absolute proof of something, and everybody has to agree, and nobody dissents. And he's just claiming that, you know, because I'm a dissenter and I'm not a mathematician, therefore he claims victory. I'm saying I'm not going to go bother looking for all of the forum pages where these things are argued and point you to all the mathematicians who would make the argument that I just made. But this is clearly not something where you could say I have proof really solid, like evolution. So again, the standard of proof is what we're arguing here. You're saying you have a sufficient standard of proof demonstrating first that Einstein's math is fundamental to his math is a recognition of space being bent, when people would argue there is no recognition that space is bent in Einstein's math, merely the effects of the fact that the sun mass is in motion. You say you've proven one thing. I'm saying I don't think you have. Alright, you have your answer why he's getting this response. You can ignore it, but that would conflict with your implication that you care about the truth, or you can, well, be honest, I don't know. So, let me save this link, but I'm not going to be called a liar, so you're done here. I'm sorry, but you're done. Okay, I'm not accepting it anymore. You have no right to do it. You have no evidence of it. It's a malicious and very rude thing to do. And I'm just going to say, fuck you. So I'll save this link, and perhaps if I can see enough coherent value, in a sense where I can be knowledge enough to analyze it, then I'll make a response to it. But yeah, I don't accept unnecessary rudeness, and that's all you've been. So fuck you. I mean, the title of his name, like I say, interferometer fail. What the hell does that even mean? Alright. Does it ever occur to you that if you smell shit, you should tell the person to check his shoes? So this is just more nonsense rhetoric. Where are you explaining how the light in the photon experiment creates the right wave pattern? Where are you proving that? But if you keep smelling shit throughout the day, you should check your own shoes. So again, this is just meaningless mush, not an argument about any goddamn thing. Maybe it has something to do with the fact that all, as far as I know, of your predictions have been wrong. There's no evidence of any of that, so I don't know if I'm going to bother reading this. You're asserting things you don't provide any evidence of. Where has anybody proved me wrong about anything here? You're just so full of shit. Just the beam splitter example is a great example. Okay, so he thinks they've proved something about beam splitters. That somehow the regular beam splitter is somehow doing a better job of splitting light than the plain piece of glass. That somehow putting a layer of glue between two prisms splits beams more evenly than a plain piece of glass. I think it's an insane assertion. Virtually insane, if you have any honesty whatsoever. Quite obviously the simpler thing is making the cleaner split. Just the beam splitter example is a great example based off the insanely poor understanding of how light behaves. So again, there's no evidence presented here. First off, even if we think of them as diffraction gradients, a diffraction pattern changes based off of wavelength, and there is no point where the openings become too small compared to the wavelength to create peripheral beams. That's an insane statement right there. So he's saying the tiny water molecules don't create small enough slits to create diffraction, when clearly they're way too small to not to. They can't help but create bent light. They're so small. Light diffracts more the smaller the hole, idiot, not the other way around. And your argument about the Heisenberg principle is even worse. It is not violated when beams don't spread because there's more than one opening, you dolt. So again, I don't even know how this proves Heisenberg at all, and how my statement about Heisenberg, which is plainly that it's an unproven, silly notion, completely unproven. Okay, anyway, the rings in your videos don't even align with the light beam. An amazing statement. I mean, I don't even know how somebody could argue with those videos. The pattern is so obvious, I freeze on it. It's right there in front of you. It's exactly the same pattern produced in all the other interferometers. This is just insanity. I don't know how you can type this and not realize you're just going to humiliate yourself. It's an insane. What, you want me to replay the videos and just show you how overtly it's exactly the same pattern? Do you want me to actually take out a ruler and measure it? I mean, you're amazingly retarded. A sign that they're what is this? Something rings and not rings. So he thinks Michelson-Morley rings, whatever those would be. I mean, Michelson-Morley actually was a telescope was used to collect the light. So clearly they weren't looking at the whole pattern. They were just looking at the very center of the pattern. But I'm comparing the pattern to the interferometers that don't use a telescope, that you display the pattern on a wall. Michelson-Morley didn't display the pattern on a wall. They looked at it through a telescope. You have to understand, a very different thing. Can you understand that a telescope is very different? Looking at a movie through a telescope is a little bit different than looking at a movie broadcast on a wall. You can actually see this at the specific time in your other video, and more obviously the rings that you had were much, much larger than the beam. Obviously. The undiffracted light was small, the diffracted light was big, yes. And they were huge without the use of any concave lenses. And I would argue that they're always huge unless you reduce them. That's exactly true. So why would I alter them with a lens when we're trying to find out what they really are? So again, this argument means nothing. All of these are such fucking obvious signs. So none of these, all I can say is look at the videos. This is an insanely stupid argument. The pattern is shown. I didn't cheat it in any way. It's quite obvious it's there. I showed it cycling even. Cycling. How can this insane person make these assertions? All of these are such fucking obvious signs that the two effects don't have anything to do with each other. So it's just so amazing. You go to the trouble to provide the evidence of a phenomenon, and here they're claiming I'm ignoring experimental evidence. I've given them a simple fucking experiment and simple fucking evidence, and they're pretending it doesn't exist when it's so fucking obviously a truth. Now, what the proper explanation of it, you could have an explanation for it and say, I can make that go away, but as a fact, you can't change it as a fact. Oh, amazing. Seriously, just buy yourself a beam splitter and look for yourself. I don't need to because I've already done it. Amazing. Although at this point, I'm not even in interest for you to do that. At this point, again, I've disposed of you, but yet don't come back. You have nothing to offer. This is not an argument. No rational person, I don't think a rational person that has any notion of all that fairness, who's not a child molester or a rapist or some other deviant, insane person, could honestly say, you've made an argument here. This is insane nonsense. It's drivel. It's less than drool. Anyway. You're so critical of everything you haven't accepted since kindergarten, yet you never critical of any of your own hypothesis. Well, frankly, I've already done the critical thinking on my own hypothesis, and clearly, as you can see in this whole chain of videos, I had lots of initial mechanisms and found they didn't work, and I crossed out my own theories. So to say I'm incapable of recognizing my own flaws, not because somebody else told me it was wrong, but because I discovered it was flawed. These are real videos. They exist on this channel. Somebody else didn't tell me it was wrong. I figured out it was wrong. The disconnect here is astonishing. It is. It really is. Yeah, well, I'm just saying, you're an astonishingly dishonest piece of creepy shit. I actually have created both the, well, why don't you show it? The quartet pattern and the MM pattern. Well, why don't you prove it? Show it. And again, what's the difference? As I just pointed out, the MM pattern, whatever you're calling that, isn't created through the same mechanism. It's displayed through a telescope. You're still not getting that? The latter is much, much harder to create. Even tried to play operations, but at the millimeter scale, it's very nerve-wracking. If you're in your video, you're just slapping things together. And I pointed that out in my video. That look how easy it is to create the pattern. You don't have to line shit up. You don't have to do anything, and you get a pattern. Now you're saying it's not the real pattern. Well, that's fine. You can say that. You can say that your pattern is somehow doing something specially interesting. The point is that when interferometers are described, the point is they say it's the two beams coming together creating the pattern. I'm just pointing out that clearly you don't need two beams combining to create the pattern. That's completely unnecessary. So when people argue this is what two beams interfering with each other look like, I'm just merely proving that I can make that pattern without intersecting two beams, without recombining light. I don't have to recombine photons to make that pattern. That's my point. You can't describe what you're arguing against for the life of you. Well, I think I have, and it'll have to be, it's up to the people reading or listening to this to decide who's being honest and credible. And instead just strawmanning things on and on. Well, I can't imagine a more insane straw man than to say the pattern isn't what it clearly was displayed in the video. And you can't even finish reading sentences without interjecting things that have nothing to do with the sentence. Well, again, that's another thing that's clearly to your perception. I rewatch all of my videos, and I don't see me making any errors at all, frankly, in terms of getting the gist of it and making a good argument at the appropriate time. You say I'm not doing it right. I'm saying I'm doing it, in my opinion, perfectly honestly and credibly. I'm not trying to distort your arguments. I'm not trying to pervert what you're saying. I'm trying to understand it and explain why I don't accept it or believe it. And that's all I'm doing. And the listener is going to have to accept that that's what I'm doing. I don't think you're right because I don't think you have evidence defending your rightness. It's completely unconvincing. And it's not because somebody's paying me $1 million to say that. It's because it doesn't make sense. Alright, real scientists don't have any obligation to address flat earthers. I'd say all scientists have an obligation to defend their own arguments. So yes, I would argue they don't have to address flat earthers unless the flat earthers have evidence relevant to the theory. So unless they can prove something to be true that the other people are believing, I'd say anybody has an obligation to defend what they're saying against evidence that's counter to it. In my opinion, I have answered the evidence counter. Alright, what I don't see you doing is answering my claims against your theory. You seem to be able to have broken evidence and you don't have to account for it. Like your two-slit pattern being wrong, like beam splitters not being clean. Why aren't you using a plain piece of glass to split the light? It works perfectly and theoretically creates a cleaner beams. It creates two beams that are more likely identical. So why aren't you doing it? The fact that you can't get that simple fact about beam splitters straight, so again, there's no fact here. The fact that you can't describe any of the theories you talk about correctly, again, the reader's going to just have to, decide for themselves who's been fair to the evidence, fair to the arguments, and who hasn't been. So I have nothing to apologize for. I haven't been demonstrated to cheat anything here at all. All you're doing is making fake, lie statements that there's somehow you have evidence that you've defeated me in some way or proven something, and you've proved nothing. Reader renders you talk about correctly, not even remotely correctly. So again, you're saying I haven't been even remotely correct in describing, for example, bent space and the idea that it's a convergence. And I talk about Susskind explaining it. Somehow I haven't been honest about that. I haven't accurately described how Susskind explains the concept. And where did you prove that? When I talk about Feynman, I somehow inaccurately described his arguments and his concepts. That he basically believes that photons are corpuscles, and he thinks the universe itself does play dice. It does create random events. Renders you as good as a flat earther. So again, your assertion based on absolutely nothing. Not an ad hom. No, it's just a grotesquely obnoxious, rude, retarded, unfounded pile of shit as a statement. I think you are a cat killer and a rapist. There, I'm done. You're a disgusting person, and I've proved it. And it's worth noting that you have the self-awareness and the argue-ness of 1-2 or whatever. Right. I'm rubber, you're glue. Fuck you, die. You're a despicably cheap, shitty little person, and you probably are a little person in every respect. Little hair follicles, little brain, little dick, big anus. Alright, Paul Worth. Man, this just goes on and on. I didn't realize these were going to be this preposterously long. Maybe I'll just quit here. I mean, Paul's not going to say anything smart, but let me just get to it real quick. You explain nothing with your blue and red thingies. Okay, so again, what do you want? There's no other way to do physics except to explain it with some sort of imagery and some sort of ideas of polarization and whatnot. You don't get it, you don't get it, fuck you. And as you said, electricity is not electrons. I never said that. I said it's clearly the movement of electrons is how you notice electricity. The force must act on matter for the force to realize any impact. So it must act on electrons, and so electricity will always be associated with the movement of electrons, but the force is what's moving the electrons. The electrons aren't moving the force is moving the electrons. It is the force that moves the electrons, obviously. What is the force? I've already explained that. That's the bits, retard. Force bits. They're photons, shithead. The virtual photons that conventional physics talks about coming off of a magnet, for example, those virtual photons pressurize the electrons. That means push the electrons closer together, and in doing so create more pressure between the electrons, and that's exactly called voltage retard. And explain how you, according to you, have positive and negative electricity. There's no such thing as positive and negative electricity. It's just a stupid concept. Okay, there's electricity happens in a direction in a conductor, so you can have two, okay, essentially positive potentials at different total potential because of ground being a neutral, which means it can be positive or it can be negative relative to the poles. So you're just pushing the electrons in different directions, which, see the difference of the directions, that means a 180-degree difference. So those two are potentials, but they're potentials to a neutral, to the middle. So there's only such things as a voltage or not a voltage relative to a position. Relative to neutral, both are a positive essentially. Relative to each other, one is much more positive than the other because of its direction alone. Anyway, have positive and negative electricity. You can't fool. Well, I just explained that actually wrong. So I'll concede the point that I have to be a little more careful. Obviously, the electrons are all pushed to one end, okay, than the other, and then you put a neutral in. One end relative to the neutral will have less electrons. One end has more electrons. But the point is it's always because it's measured in one direction. So there's no two directions. There's only one thing. More electrons or less electrons. And the ground can be arbitrary in a sense. And the ground's not arbitrary. It's obviously one thing, ground. And so you either have more or less relative to ground. So that's the point. The ground is the decider, and a positive voltage is less electrons. The negative voltage is more electrons. So I'm sorry I was unclear on that. This is a long video, so I probably should have stopped while I was ahead. But anyway, so let's see what this other asshole says. If you're going to defend him, how about you explain these two things? Here we go. His theory doesn't give the Lorentz force. My theory doesn't care about some kind of notion of a Lorentz force or any of these other named forces. I've already explained all the forces I need to that exist. So if you want to say it doesn't explain magnetic force, of course it does. So my obligation is to explain the force of magnetism, not the force of Lorentz. In my opinion, there is no force of Lorentz. His theory doesn't even give forces at all. Well, of course it does. I mean, I don't even know how somebody can make that assertion. It's just an insane assertion. These tons being deflected at 90 degrees. The ones coming from the sides will fill in the shadows. Oh, we've already done this at both ends. No, that just doesn't happen. It's clearly not enough force. So just more lies. If I haven't blocked you already, I'll get it done now. I just don't remember whether I did or not, but yeah, you're done here. I have addressed the point. It's a nonsensical point. I was just curious. Maybe you're talking a long time taking a long. Maybe you think Emendum has dealt with this adequately. Maybe you don't know and want Emendum to reply. But I phrased the 2 points that way because I don't think he dealt with them at all. I already asserted that I think I have. I'll assert that as a point, and I said in the last video quite clearly that if I will make a future video on the subject again and point out how electrons move, and I'll point out again that the force coming in from the side is never sufficient to undo an imbalance that exists in the net system. You can't undo the net imbalance. It will be served. This, going this way, can't undo the net imbalance. It can only change as things are moving through time if the force stops. If there's no continuation of the force, then it will be erased by this happening. But when this erases the imbalance between two things, left and right, it will create an imbalance top to bottom. it's conservational. You can never fix the unbalance. It'll always reoccur in some other location. You can never destroy the energy. Fuck. If you're going to think you just did, you just didn't get it, and Mendham has dealt with it billions of times. So yeah, that's his argument to you. I have already addressed this in videos. It's on the website. You have no evidence of this extra energy that overcomes the imbalance. That somehow, if I put 10 things going this way and 10 things going this way, somehow the stuff going this way is going to undo the fact that there's 10 too much this way and there's 10 too much that way. It can't undo it. Alright, just consider that exactly what everyone else is thinking about DraftScience. That's all. Well, whatever. You're thinking something. That's your problem, in my opinion. You have a diseased and sick little brain. You're a petty little fuck, and you haven't made one argument that means a goddamn thing, in my opinion, and that addresses a goddamn point I've made. You haven't addressed a single one of my arguments with anything other than a grotesque lie that somehow the videotape of the pattern I showed is in some way different than every interferometer image on the internet. Just about 95% of the interferometer images are exactly like the pattern I showed, and if you say otherwise, you're just a liar. I think that's it, right? If you want to increase the odds of being taken seriously, right? So this guy can go fuck off. Too. Fuck you. Alright, so, oops, I think I clicked the wrong thing again. I don't know why my finger tends to go to that bottom one rather than the top one, but it tends to do that. So there, I've disposed of all the comments again. Great. Yeah. And you certainly deserved it. And you've certainly wasted a big pile of my time, and I'm sorry to the people listening to these videos. I did talk fast, and I did try to get through it all, but clearly there wasn't any arguments being made here. Nothing was challenged. It's just the same old drool. No arguments at all. No evidence, no arguments. Okay, so we're done. Probably 2 hours. I'm sorry. It feels like 2 hours.